What's going on, guys? It's M Kwan here, and today I've got a review for you after a month of use and after all the hype on the new 2021 MacBook Pro. The laptop for me and my work is central because I do a lot of content creation on it, and after using my 2016 MacBook Pro for a few years, I was excited to upgrade to this 16-inch MacBook Pro powered by the M1 Pro. Now, some of you might be wondering why the M1 Pro and not the Max. I'll talk about this in this video along with my honest experiences with this device. I'm talking the good and the bad. Now, the obvious place to start off is with the design because this is big. Apple seemed to have scrapped that slim, minimal look they've been doing for the last couple of years with the MacBooks for something much more functional. Yes, the new MacBook Pro is more boxy and bulky, but it's not all bad. Compared with my older 15-inch MacBook Pro, it's got a similar footprint, though slightly longer, which is important if you carry this around in backpacks. It's noticeably heavier, something that did throw me off, but it's a small trade-off in my opinion for the battery life and the screen benefits. And if you're the type of person that dislikes lugging around a heavier laptop, maybe you're a student or you just commute a lot, then do consider the 14-inch MacBook Pro, especially given the fact that you can configure that to your needs. Now, thank Tim Cook, because this new form factor also brings back a lot of the ports they decided to take away in the first place. Still don't understand why Apple did this to their Pro devices, but anyway. Now let's take a closer look at all those new ports. Beginning with this side over here, you'll notice that you've got two USB-C Thunderbolt 4 ports, and then you've got one on this side over here. Those can be used for peripherals. They can actually also be used for charging the MacBook Pro. Talking of charging, check that out. We have the return of the MagSafe charger. What is really cool here is that it connects via magnets. It's actually much more firmer than the older version of the MacBooks that had the MagSafe charger. And I like the fact that you have that wired cable. Plus, depending on the configuration that you go with, you also get 140 watt charging brick, which surprisingly isn't as heavy as I was expecting. It is slightly bulky, but it's used there for fast charging, which is really important because you don't get the fast charging with the USB-C cables on the 16-inch. Now, you also have that 3.5mm headphone jack. On this side over here is probably where most video content creators will be excited because you have the HDMI port and, more importantly, the SD card slot. Check that out. That is really, really cool to see. I'm so glad Apple brought that back. Right, related to SD card, I have an issue, and this is actually an issue that is popping up more and more on the forums. This is a 64GB SD card. I have two of these. Now, I'm not sure if it's this kind of format or something related to the SD card reader on the Macs, but currently I get a beach ball when I plug in the 64GB into the MacBook Pro directly. This is a 128GB SD card. I have two of these, and there are no issues whatsoever when I use these in the MacBook Pro. Both of these are formatted in NTSC. I've also experimented with PAL formatting. The 64GB still has the same issue. What is really odd is if I plug this into this, which is a USB-C SD card reader, there are no issues whatsoever. And if you go on the forums, more and more people are talking about this. Hopefully it's just a bug from macOS Monterey or in macOS Monterey, something that Apple can fix quickly, please. Now, another big update to the hardware this year is the keyboard. Apple have done away with the touch bar, which quite honestly, I'm happy to say goodbye to, because for a Pro device, I felt it was quite gimmicky. And that actually crapped out on me once where my MacBook needed to be taken in for a repair for an entire week. So the new keyboard has a nice feel to it when typing, and the function keys at the top are much more practical. I really like how Apple have done this black on black feature as well on the keyboard. Though with lots of use, you will notice more dirt accumulate there. And you still have that really nice trackpad, which I still think is one of the best in the game. Now, the speakers on this are absolutely incredible. You've got high fidelity, and they're a 6-speaker sound system with force cancelling woofers. You've got wide stereo sound, and there's also support for spatial audio when playing music or videos with Dolby Atmos on the built-in speakers. They sound absolutely incredible. Another major hardware change is in the display. The display on this is simply stunning. It feels like it's been pulled back at the borders when you compare it with, let's say, my older MacBook Pro, and you get some incredible colors and punchiness to that display. The notch, which I'm sure you and everybody else has also noticed, houses a 1080p FaceTime camera. Okay, so here's a quick example of what the new front-facing camera, the 1080p FaceTime camera looks like on the new MacBook Pro. It is very, very different compared to this, which is what I'm currently recording on the older MacBook Pro. The difference between night and day. You'll notice that there is much more brightness with this, there's more details. It's still not crispy as I was expecting, but it still does a very, very good job, much better than this. Also, the differences between the audio, you'll be able to tell that the audio quality on this is much poorer than you're getting on the newer MacBook Pro. It would have been nice with all that space that the notch takes for Apple to have included Face ID. I don't know why they haven't done that this time. Perhaps with the future updates, it would have been nice to see that incorporated with the new MacBook Pro as well. Now, when it comes to the screen tech, Apple have updated that to give us ProMotion, which is essentially a variable refresh rate that goes all the way up to 120 Hertz. But there is an issue, and that is that many applications aren't utilizing it at the moment. Even some of Apple's own apps like Safari don't take advantage of ProMotion yet, but I think that'll change relatively soon. We also get an XDR display with peak brightness up to 1600 nits, which is impressive because if you compare it with my older MacBook Pro, that went up to 500 nits. But just be aware that this is limited to HDR content. Now, Apple have also switched the displays to mini LED, hence the slightly thicker display, but the upside is the incredible high contrast range along with those deep true blacks that you're going to notice. Honestly, all these changes, despite some of the limitations I've mentioned, means in practice and moving forward, you're going to absolutely love using this display for your work. And I think once Apple have refined some of those issues, it's going to be amazing. Now, when it comes to performance, Apple went over and above what they needed to do when they announced the M1 Pro and the M1 Max chips. Remember, the M1 chip architecture is based on an SoC, a system on a chip that, unlike traditional processors, is able to better manage resources in the way that the CPU and the GPU work off the same unified memory. Now, this model I have has a 10-core CPU with a 16-core GPU along with 32 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of SSD storage. I personally feel that this is a sweet spot in terms of price and performance balance for myself, but also for anybody else that might be considering getting a new MacBook Pro this size for video content. Now, I generally use 4K, multiple 4K streams, no more than about 4, and this has worked really well, particularly with Final Cut Pro. So editing a 4K timeline video of around 10 minutes in Final Cut Pro, and the new MacBook Pro was noticeably faster, especially with the plugins and effects that I use, but rendering that video then took substantially less time on the new MacBook Pro at around about 11 minutes than my older MacBook. And to give you some context, the older MacBook is an i7, it's 16 gigabytes of RAM, it's got a dedicated GPU as well. Now, for me, that's a noticeable difference. But what is important here is that the older MacBooks, the fans would kick in really quickly. In fact, when I was editing, and it's the small things like lower rendering times, the instant on, etc. That day-to-day makes a big difference, particularly if you use your MacBook for doing stuff. Now, battery life on the new MacBook Pro is simply incredible. It's got a whopping 100-watt battery, but the optimization with the M1 Pro really keeps it going on and on. Now, the difference between the M1 Pro and the M1 Max is, one of the differences is the fact the Max, both in idle and under load, will actually draw more power due to those additional cores. But for me, on a single charge, I was able to get around about 11 to 13 hours worth of continuous actual use, with rendering of larger files bringing that down slightly. It's still incredible. I think Apple have done really well this year with the 2021 MacBook Pro. Whether you go for the 14 or the 16 inch, I think as a long-time MacBook user and having used this for over 200 plus hours now, these updates are pretty much what most of us were begging Apple to do. It's now a real pro device, a professional device, and those updates both to the ports, to the display, to the performance have really meant that this is one of those laptops which I think, quite honestly, is probably the best there on the market. Now, when it comes to price tag, this is not a cheap laptop. It certainly commands a premium over a lot of the other laptops that are out there. But as someone that reviews very many laptops during the year, what I have to say is that if you are a serious content creator, somebody that wants a professional laptop then really the MacBook Pro does deliver and go above and beyond what it promises to do. The real difference here and where you can make the savings is in the performance, the processor that you choose, and some of the other updates when it comes to RAM and storage space. This thing really doesn't break a sweat whatsoever. What was also very important to me was battery life, and unlike the M1 Max, which really does go up in performance, the M1 Pro does boast a better battery life. So a combination of those things, as well as being slightly cheaper than the M1 Max, makes it a really good option to consider. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and do follow me over on Instagram as well, where I'll be posting daily updates through IG stories. Until next time, I'm Kwan. Stay safe. I will see you here on the channel for another video review soon. Peace and blessings.